The quick and careful work done by the Abwehr in the weeks immediately preceding the occupation of Denmark and Norway was in many cases the result of improvisation and initiative, and it was very effective. But these assignments were comparatively small in scope and brief in time. As an example of an operation of great range and large scale carried out by German intelligence, the preparations for war against France in particular and against the Western powers in general are of much greater significance. Although in some respects comparable to the Abwehr's activities in Poland, they were much larger and much more complex, in fact affecting every department of the Abwehr. There was one vital element in particular which was missing from the Polish operation. The intelligence against Poland was a typical example of secret service work against a country of military importance, but virtually devoid of any naval significance. Moreover, it was also an operation against a country that was contiguous with Germany along a long land border. It is true that France and Germany also had a long land border to the west, but the other countries were directly out of reach, except Holland and Belgium, and no organized reconnaissance was carried out against the latter two. They were to play the role of some kind of host countries, bases for action against other countries. But they themselves were not regarded as targets for reconnaissance, nor were they thought to be regarded as potential adversaries. All other countries in the West were of both military and naval interest, and the way in which intelligence was organized against them is described by an officer who worked for many years in naval intelligence in that theatre of war. In January 1934, I was posted to the Abwehr branch of the North Sea Fleet Command at Wilhelmshaven. The base had practically no agents or channels of communication. It had an auxiliary unit in Hamburg in which another representative was engaged in intelligence. Initially, the Wilhelmshaven office had the sole task of organizing a network of informants in Holland and Belgium who would be able to send a message in the event of any crisis or mobilization in France and Britain. Painstaking preparatory work of this kind is not a very pleasant occupation. Informers recruited in case of need have no training, and when a crisis actually comes, they usually fail to fulfill the task assigned to them. One happy coincidence brought a little cheer to this generally hopeless picture. One day 2 merchant seamen came to the Abwehr office and handed us drawings of a device intended for the American Air Force which they had picked up somewhere in the United States. They had no idea of the purpose or importance of the device, but the blueprints clearly looked real. At the time, the American Army and Navy as such were of no particular interest to German intelligence. But information about technical advances, which in those days were seen in foreign armies frequently and at short intervals, and which might well have been used in German forces, was of course of great interest. In Germany itself, the construction of a naval fleet was severely restricted by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, while the creation of military aviation was entirely forbidden. On the other hand, little attention was paid to the safety and security of secrets in the United States, and it was not difficult for skillful agents to penetrate into important building and industrial centers and learn much more about production methods than was reported to the general public. And although a study of American publications usually gave a very good idea of the trend of technological progress, it was only by trial and error that definitive and accurate information could be obtained. In the course of time, however, we were thus able to obtain designs for new aeroplanes, bombing devices, and appliances of a similar kind. And finally, we obtained a whole series of drawings of various new types of destroyers and battleships, and even secret instructions to guide their construction. When Admiral Canaris took charge of intelligence in 1935, he ordered that the department be transferred from Wilhelmshaven, which had been, in his opinion, a mere canteen of the armed forces and a very inconvenient base, for a base whose purpose was to conduct reconnaissance, to another large city in the neighborhood. There, under new and more favorable conditions, it became possible to launch, via Holland and Belgium, the so-called North French route, systematic reconnaissance surveillance of the French Navy, at least in aspects concerning the Channel and the Atlantic coast. This included reconnaissance of coastal defense installations, naval docks and commercial ports, and their respective characteristics, as well as types and methods of construction of warships with details of their construction, armor and armament, torpedo tubes, minesweepers, anti-submarine devices, anti-aircraft armament, etc. Finally, we needed information on the location of aircraft carrier bases and airfields in the immediate vicinity of the coast, as well as details of the fuel supply to the French Navy and Army, as well as the location and capacity of oil refineries, and their importance not only as sources of supply for the French armed forces, but also as targets, if necessary, for our air force. To fulfill these tasks, we slowly and diligently recruited people and created a network of agents, most of whom, however, were not French but of other nationalities. They then underwent a rigorous course of training at the intelligence center, where the importance of the particular area in which each man was to work was stressed, and the general principles of intelligence methods to be followed with regard to plans of fortifications, methods of building ships, economic matters such as supply and oil requirements, etc., and the matters were fully outlined and explained. As a rule, the men who went for enlistment were inspired by a love of adventure, and many of them needed no persuasion, but simply volunteered their services, and it was very important that the officer to whom they and their training were entrusted should be able to establish an atmosphere of mutual confidence. For his part, that officer must be convinced that he could trust his agents, and they, on the other hand, must be equally confident that they could absolutely rely on their officer's assistance if ever they encountered difficulties. This atmosphere of mutual trust cannot be achieved by money alone. Admiral Canaris himself attached great importance to the exclusion of methods leading to pressure or blackmail to which agents were subjected. He also forbade the use of so-called agents provocateurs, and in these matters he was inexorable and reacted with extreme severity to any disobedience to his instructions. He really desired that the intelligence service should be managed in an honourable and dignified manner. This reconnaissance of French coastal areas was gradually expanded successfully to include also the southern coast of France. In addition to the long-range activity outlined above, reconnaissance was also carried out from the west of Germany and from the south through Spain. Of course, the main object of our endeavours was the Maginot Line as a defensive system of paramount importance. Frogott's desertion from the French Commissariat Department led to a court case, which for a long time excited great interest in the French and foreign press. He had been responsible for the supply of rations to the troops on the Maginot Line and had placed his vast knowledge at the disposal of the German authorities. In addition, much valuable material was found after the occupation of Prague in 1938. The Czech defence system against Germany was built with French assistance on the model of the Maginot Line, and in this connection a Czech technical commission visited the French defensive fortifications and returned with many detailed drawings and specifications. Military cooperation between Czechoslovakia, a member of the Little Entente, and France was, in fact, very close, and its fruits, to the great benefit of the German intelligence service, were found in Division I of the Czechoslovak General Staff. Originally, all intelligence activity against Great Britain was forbidden, and it was not until 1936 that this rule was relaxed somewhat and surveillance was allowed. But even then we were not allowed permanent agents. But in the autumn of 1937 these restrictions were lifted, and we were given complete freedom of action, not only in the United Kingdom itself, but also in checking reports on naval and overseas bases. The recruitment of agents capable of covering such a vast area presented enormous difficulties. But by the time war was declared, we had succeeded in obtaining most of the really important information in regard to the Royal Navy that we required, although our file was by no means as complete as in the case of the French Navy and its various naval bases. The introduction of agents into Britain was extremely difficult. The British were in a position to exercise a much more effective system of control over all foreigners arriving on their island than was possible for a country with a land border. In addition, a passionate desire to play the role of amateur detective is a characteristic trait of all Britons, and it is no mere coincidence that Conan Doyle, the father of modern detective novels, and Edgar Wallace are both British and vastly superior in skill to authors of detective literature in other countries. The average Briton also treats foreigners with a degree of distrust, however polite he may be to them in normal day-to-day interactions. The problem to which Canaris himself, and consequently the whole intelligence service, paid special attention was to devise means to ensure that the transmission of messages in times of crisis and mobilization was uninterrupted, and above all that the agents used for other tasks were thoroughly trained and told what they should do in the event of any crisis. Each agent whose activities were to be carried out in times of crisis was provided with a personal code word, upon receipt of which he was obliged to immediately cease all work in progress and go at once to a specified area, where he was to visit a number of prearranged places from which he would send his messages of preparation for war. through prearranged lines of communication and in encrypted form. This system was first put into operation in 1936, when the Rhineland area was reoccupied. Although the period of preparation before the network was brought into operation was very short, the network functioned splendidly, and the military high command received a timely and accurate picture of the measures taken by the neighbouring armies and navies as a result of this reoccupation. The same procedure was followed on two subsequent occasions, the occupation of Austria and the Sudeten crisis. The march into Austria was scheduled for Saturday. On the previous Thursday, the chiefs of all intelligence departments had suddenly been ordered to report immediately to Canaris, who informed them that Hitler intended to march into Austria and to solve the Austrian problem, if necessary, by force. Both the gravity of the case and the Admiral's extreme concern were evident to all present. The intelligence offices worked day and night. All necessary instructions were sent out, and the service waited for the reports. And the reports came, and almost all were unanimous, that the reaction and countermeasures in all the neighbouring countries were negligible. The service functioned marvellously, and the intelligence network placed for periods of crisis and mobilization gave a correct and accurate picture of the situation. By the time of the aggravation of the Sudeten crisis, the system had been greatly improved, and it worked at least as well as it had done on the previous occasion, if not better. In 1938, we achieved some outstanding successes, but we also suffered some sensitive defeats. And of the latter, one occurred in the United States and owed much to the fact that at this time the secret state police, the Gestapo, which in reality was a purely internal organization, was making its way into intelligence activities abroad. This state of affairs was in direct contradiction to the agreement signed by Canaris and Heydrich, the Gestapo chief. In addition, at about the same time, a marked psychosis developed in the Third Reich, and citizens were led to believe that by sending messages from abroad of any kind that seemed important to them, they were serving the interests of their fatherland. Further and further, a whole host of individuals suddenly found themselves exceptionally talented for intelligence work, and they felt obliged to devote their lives to the intelligence service. Amateurs of this kind were invariably immediately conspicuous, because they always had a facially exaggerated opinion of their importance as keepers of great secrets and servants of a great mission. Their whole demeanour gave them away immediately, and more often than not they attracted attention long before they had even succeeded in approaching a target of utterly insignificant intelligence value. The United States of America was the paradise of these ardent eccentrics, and from there they sent a flood of their reports to the NS State Foreign Office, to the Arbeitsfront, a neighbour organization, to the German Air Ministry, and even sometimes to the German railways, since all these organizations had representatives in the United States. As early as 1936 or 1937, one agent of Division Aviation of the Abwehr was exposed by the Americans as a spy, and only with the greatest difficulty and with the help of friends escaped by car to Canada and from there to Germany. As a result of this case, the FBI increased its vigilance, and its interest was centred on the Bund der Freunde des Neuen Deutschlands, Association of Friends of the New Germany. My office and its employees received repeated warnings of the danger of this organization and of the inadmissibility of association with any of its leaders, in view of the distances involved and the limitations of the courier system that existed. Anything that was subject to effective control became unusable. Worst of all, about this time one of our couriers, a man whose 4 years of conscientious service had inspired justifiable confidence, came under the influence of one Rumrich, a Sudeten German living in the United States. This Rumrich devised the most fantastic plans and succeeded in inducing a hitherto reliable agent to cooperate, on his own responsibility, in an enterprise in the United States of which we in Germany knew nothing. He had the idea of luring a senior officer of the American Army, say, the commandant of some fortress or the like, to meet him in some bar and persuade him to give out a plan for mobilizing the fortress and the units under his command. He obtained postal paper and envelopes from the War Ministry and wrote to an officer of his choice, ordering him to meet a representative of that ministry at a certain public establishment and to give him the schemes and plans enumerated in the letter. He himself intended to play the part of the representative of the War Ministry. The selected officer obediently showed up at the appointed time and place, and with him were FBI agents who immediately arrested Rumrich. On further interrogation, Rumrich immediately gave a whole list of names, and it became clear that he had indeed managed to organize a whole system of secret communication. It so happened that the confidential courier of the Abwehr was at this moment on holiday outside the United States. Not knowing his superior officer, he recruited as a temporary deputy a woman hairdresser of the liner Europa, to whom he gave full instructions and then went on holiday. Faced with a fait accompli, his superior officer had no option but to utilize this woman to the best of his ability to keep the courier service running. This temporary courier was, of course, known to Rumrich, and she was among the first he gave out. When the Europa docked in New York, Johanna Hoffmann, the hairdresser, was arrested as soon as she stepped ashore, and all the mail she was carrying was seized. Among those arrested were a well-known New York physician and his mistress. The lady was promptly released, and the doctor was warned and also regained his freedom, which he immediately took advantage of to escape to Germany as a hare on a German ship. The American authorities attempted to detain the ship when it was beyond the 3-mile zone, but the captain refused to stop the ship, and the doctor reached Germany in safety. Further, a number of other people involved in the case managed to escape to Germany. However, they had nothing to do with the German military intelligence service, but turned out to be involved in the above-mentioned system of secret communication as mutual acquaintances, or were connected with other organizations that had stuck their curious noses into the spy pie. The weeks afterwards, the headlines in the American press blaze. Nazi spies in America. Hunting Nazi spies continues. The whole episode was inflated to absurd proportions, and 18 men were indicted, among them German officers. Colonel Bosch, Captains Second-Rank Menzel and von Bonin, and Captain Pfeiffer. This case is described in a book by FBI employee Leo. Thorough, I must say. Very entertaining, where it is shown that the FBI failed to assess the confusing situation and did not realize that only a small part of the accused were really working for German military intelligence. The inevitable result of this case, which dragged on from March to the summer of 1938, was that in our activities against the United States we had to be extremely cautious, and we had to wait. Later, with increased security measures, the work was resumed. A whole team of agents worked in strict compliance with the orders of the officer in charge, treating themselves as individual workers and not as members of the secret communication channel, described above, and this continued to produce satisfactory results until the outbreak of war. But in the days before the war, far more important were the preparations against France. And it was in France and the Benelux countries in the summer of 1940, the Abwehr, created and trained by Canaris, was undergoing a real test. It was there that Abwehr I first really came into action in support of a major military operation, in planning the surprise invasion of Holland, Belgium and Luxembourg. The main concern was to capture the bridges over the Meuse and the Albert Canal intact. Only if this was done could the ground forces quickly reach the Peel defence line in Holland and subsequently quickly release the parachutists dropped in the vicinity of Rotterdam. In November 1939, a meeting on the matter was held in the Reich Chancellery under Hitler's chairmanship. As a result, the Abwehr was ordered to draw up a plan to seize, with the help of troops disguised in Dutch and Belgian uniforms, the most important bridges over the Meuse, 2 roads and a railway bridge in Maastricht, and 1 road and 1 railway bridge in Hennep. At the beginning of the preparations, a most alarming failure occurred. The agent charged with obtaining the uniform was captured by the Belgians with the uniform in hand. In connection with the mysterious theft of uniforms, a Flemish newspaper published a caricature of Goering in the uniform of a Brussels tram conductor, admiring himself in the mirror with the caption, "It suits me well." It was quite surprising that this episode did not arouse any suspicion in either Holland or Belgium, and that no warnings were given to the border guards as a result. Had the Dutch, for example, guessed the meaning of their uniforms, they would have avoided a surprise defeat at Genappe and might have delayed the German advance, which, however, would probably not have affected the fate of the Western campaign, but might have cut off the landing troops landed in the Dutch rear. The Maastricht Bridges operation was not carried out by the Brandenburg Regiment, but by a volunteer unit of the Breslau Subdivision Special Forces Battalion 100. The advance party, dressed in uniforms issued by the Dutch, drove through Rheden and Sittard to Maastricht in the early morning of 10 May 1940. What happened afterwards is not fully known. We can only assume for certain that one of the bridges on the road leading to Maastricht was captured, but the detonation charge was not removed. After a fierce firefight in which the commander of these false Dutchmen, Lieutenant Hoke, was killed, All 3 bridges were blown up, the Maastricht venture ended in utter failure, and the Abwehr chief had a depressed look when, arriving a few hours later, he found that all the columns of tanks and lorries had jammed the roads leading to Maastricht, waiting impatiently for the corps of engineers to throw a field bridge across the river. For the Maastricht operation had been conceived precisely to avoid this loss of time in a blitz attack. The success of the operation at Genappe, carried out by part of the Special Forces Battalion, 800 Brandenburg Regiment, under Lieutenant Walther, more or less counterbalanced the failure at Maastricht. And as soon as he heard that the bridges of Genappe had been captured intact, General von Reichenau, commander of the 6th Army, which was fighting its way through the narrow gap between Roermond and Liege, was able immediately to divert some of the formations stranded at Maastricht to the road to Genappe. This Genappe venture was most carefully planned and executed under partial camouflage. A reconnaissance platoon disguised as German prisoners under a Dutch convoy captured the bridge long before the hour of 0, and before the Dutch could recover from the shock. A column of German tanks was already rolling across the important Meuse crossing. Prisoners were soldiers of the Brandenburg Regiment with hand grenades and automatic pistols hidden under their cloaks. And the convoy consisted of agents of the Flemish nationalist movement Mussert, disguised in the uniforms of Dutch border guards, the achievement of a purely military objective by secret service methods. In other words, the tactical coordination of regular troops and agents was successfully utilized for the first time in this case with Genappe. While Division II of the Abwehr helped to open the gates for the invading army, Division I took over field reconnaissance and accompanied the vanguard. The following report was made of its activities. On 10 May, the day of zeros for the Western Campaign, Captain 3rd Rank Kilven was ordered to organize a group of Abwehr Marine commandos to Cologne and join with it the troops entering Holland. Except for the activities of the Abwehr I commandos who had participated in the Polish campaign and were now accompanying the troops in Holland, Captain 3rd Rank Kilven had nothing to draw upon in determining the composition and armament of the group he was to prepare. It was ordered to make its way with those parts of the invasion force which had been assigned to seize the ports and coastal towns, and there to collect all material of an intelligence nature, to study and sort it as rapidly as possible, and to forward at once whatever was of immediate tactical value to the military headquarters in charge of the operation, and the rest of the material should be subsequently delivered to the Abwehr headquarters in Berlin. From this it can be seen that it was very important to secure a sufficient number of vehicles. The Commando group was also reinforced by a motorized platoon of secret field police and a radio operator equipped with an AFU spy radio. During the advance, the task of the commandos was expanded by orders to leave a small unit at each important port to fulfill the role of a group transmitting secret intelligence information. 3 days later, on 13 May, the commandos began their advance and first went into action in the Rotterdam area, reaching the city itself at the same time as the forward regular units. Particular importance was attached to the capture of specimens of degassing apparatus, an invention said to be capable of neutralizing the effects of German magnetic mines. A number of these devices were found on various ships, dismantled and sent to Germany. And in one shipyard a plan for the construction of all this apparatus was found. In order to make Rotterdam their headquarters for the moment, the commandos sent one platoon to be present at the capture of Den Helder and another with the troops advancing on Antwerp. At both these points, as ordered, information transfer teams were left behind. The commandos were then attached to the 4th Army, to whose headquarters they reached via Brussels and Maubeuge, from where they accompanied von Kleist's army in its advance on the Channel ports. For some amazing reason, the defending French did not destroy their archives, nor even the various documents in military vehicles stranded in shallow water near the beaches, and at Boulogne and other ports. A mass of most valuable material was captured. At the British RAF Air Base, the cipher used for communications between the British and French armies fell into German hands, together with the key for May to June 1949. Further advance led first to Calais and Dunkirk, then southwest to Les Tréport, Dieppe, Stad-Valery, Le Havre and Rouen, and finally to Brest, and south to Rochefort. Meanwhile, the Germans had seized the archives of the French Ministry of Marine in Paris. When the armistice with France was concluded, Brest became a major intelligence base with tentacles extending into unoccupied France, North Africa, the Iberian Peninsula and Britain itself. a team from the Voyage division was ordered to infiltrate England and deploy saboteurs. However, the high hopes that were assigned to the base in Brest were not fulfilled. What Canaris once said about Wilhelmshaven was fully applicable to Brest. It is impossible to do intelligence work from the canteen of the armed forces. Much has been said about the ABWE's activities in Ireland, much of it grossly exaggerated or simply untrue. Shortly before the outbreak of war, German policy had envisaged friendly relations with the British Empire. In view of this, ABWE was expressly forbidden to have any dealings with the Irish Republican Army, either in Eire, Ulster, Great Britain or the United States. Although the ABWE had gathered a certain amount of information on Ireland through agents visiting that country, it was of no value in military terms. In the months leading up to the war, however, contact was made with a leading personality in the Irish economy, a man who, although not publicly associated with the Irish Republican movement, was believed to have access to its leaders. With the outbreak of war, this contact was still unreliable to be used as a means for mutual exchange of information. ABWE therefore sent an agent to London via a neutral country. This man was to pass the necessary codes, etc. To that Irishman, for it was hoped that eventually a radio link could be established between Ireland and Germany. In fact, it was quite impractical to attempt to establish radio communication in this way, and the ABWE had to rely on oral and written reports transmitted through its own agents visiting Ireland via neutral countries. Only one Irish courier reached Germany during the whole war. Overall, it can be said that although the leaders of the Irish Republican movement were prepared throughout the war to cooperate with the Germans, nevertheless they were not prepared to receive orders from Germany. At the same time, the IRA was weakened by the wave of sabotage and propaganda activities it had become involved in 1938, mainly in Liverpool and London, as most of its most active and capable members had been arrested and were now in prison. The Germans therefore endeavoured to ensure that the power which the IRA possessed was directed more towards military than political and propaganda activities. In view of this, it was decided to send Captain Dr. Gertz, an ABWE RI officer, to Ireland. He was to be the liaison officer between ABWE RTI and the IRA command headquarters in Southern Ireland. He was given wide discretionary powers at his discretion and within the limits of the above objectives, and was free to act as he saw fit. One of his tasks, however, was to establish radio contact with Berlin, if possible. His mission was an almost total failure. He landed by parachute, but by mistake in Northern Ireland instead of Southern Ireland. He lost his radio, which was on another parachute. He was on the verge of being captured by the Royal Ulster Constabulary. When, after a harrowing journey, he finally made contact with the IRA in Eire, it was discovered that the organisation was split by internal strife. In fact, his time was so occupied with preventing an opposition group in the IRA from extraditing him to the Free State authorities that he never got round to carrying out his military tasks. The whole affair left Dr. Ertz in a state of nervous prostration, and he was determined to return to Germany, but he was unable to do so because he was promptly arrested by the police and interned. The seriousness with which he regarded his mission and his loyalty to his real colleagues within the IRA is shown by the fact that he committed suicide when finally the Irish government, yielding to strong diplomatic pressure, agreed to hand him over to the Anglo-Americans. The ABWE was slightly, though not by much, more successful with the Irish in America. The IRA had a solid and effective organisation on the East Coast. Its members were well trained, especially in sabotage. They were commanded by the former Chief of Staff of the entire IRA, Sion Russell. He had travelled to Germany via Genoa in April 1940 as a stowaway aboard the American liner George Washington. It had become too hot for him in the United States, and in addition he wished to organise cooperation with the Germans. The ABWE established contact with his men in America through an ABWE unit in Mexico City, which was in the competent hands of a German businessman. But it soon became clear that the American IRA was not only anti-British in character, but also very anti-capitalist. Like their counterparts in Ireland, they absolutely refused to take instructions from Germany. In fact, they deliberately acted against the wishes of Germany, which at the time was anxious to avoid clashes with the United States. The German Foreign Office absolutely forbade all sabotage in the United States. But the IRA ignored this and tried their best to blow up British ships and destroy factories working for the British. This ABWE unit in Mexico City later had to be closed for security reasons. With the outbreak of hostilities between Germany and the USSR, the anti-capitalist bias within the American IRA made all prospects of cooperation between the organization and Germany impossible. The former IRA Chief of Staff remained in Berlin as a protégé of the Foreign Office. German plans for the invasion of England, as is well known, did not envisage a simultaneous attack on Ireland, but it was envisaged that when the battle in Britain unfolded, the British might occupy the Free State. The presence of the former IRA Chief of Staff at the time was therefore of some significance. Indeed, it was his supreme achievement. In the event of a British invasion of Ireland, the Germans intended to support the expected Irish resistance movement by all available means other than actually sending troops. This, it was thought, would maximize the benefit to the German cause. The former Chief of Staff was therefore sent to Ireland in a submarine to make the necessary preparations. However, even this ended in nothing as the man died of an attack of US Fajal-Ulker on board the ship and was buried at sea. The submarine returned to Lorient. After the abandonment of Operation Sea Lion, Germany's main interest in Ireland was that the country should remain neutral. In view of this, all ABWE activities were drastically curtailed and at one time even banned. However, when the Battle of the Atlantic reached its climax in 1942, and the value of Irish ports was keenly felt in England, the risk of a British invasion seems to have re-emerged. The Germans now had their own advisor on Irish affairs, a well-known Irish politician who had made an impressive career as a one-time officer in the Spanish Republican International Brigade, had been captured and condemned to death by Franco, but this sentence was later commuted to 30 years in prison. The convict was released through the intervention of Admiral Canaris in 1940 and taken to Germany. He was a tragically impractical man, and before the end of the war he also died. His health had been undermined by his tortures in the Spanish War and in Spanish prisons. Thus the activities of ABWE in Ireland during the Second World War, as we shall see, were very minor and had no military effect on the course of the war. The reason for this is not to be sought far away, and it is not at all due to constant bad luck, as was the case with Dr. Goetz being thrown out in the wrong place, with the death of the former IRA Chief of Staff, etc. ABWE, with its purely military task, constantly found itself on a knife edge with the Foreign Office, which of course acted out of political considerations. The Foreign Office effectively thwarted all the plans of ABWE. However, this is not a criticism of the Foreign Office. The whole course of the Second World War shows how important it is that military plans play second fiddle to political decisions. The same applies to the role of ABWE in the West. After the fall of France and during the preparations for Operation Sea Lion, the ABWE department also found itself preoccupied with matters of little importance. For at first there was no sign of any attempt at espionage or sabotage on the part of the opponents. The French population seemed to be in shock at events, but the I spy a spy for a spy complex within the troops themselves was creating an enormous amount of work. Acts of sabotage were seen in every conceivable type of daily occurrence, and ABWE officers were constantly on the move, confirming, investigating, and calling urgent meetings with various commanders and their staffs. Reports of sabotage against telegraph lines and of mysterious beams and signals were particularly numerous. But almost all of these were found to have a perfectly innocuous explanation. At the end of the summer of 1940, new tasks arose, when that part of the old commandos which was still mobile was transferred to Paris and attached to Army Group A at Saint-Germain, where it was ordered to proceed to organize the ABWE Commando for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. For this operation, the Supreme Headquarters proposed the use of 2 assault armies, the 18th and 9th Armies with the 6th Army in the rearguard. Each army was to be equipped with an ABWE Commando for active reconnaissance and an ABWE Commando of the ABWE division to combat the activities of the enemy intelligence service. Particular attention was given to radio communications and maps, plans of cities, plans of shipyards and other such installations which had been collected in advance and which were now of the utmost importance to the armies in their advance. When Operation Sea Lion was finally abandoned in the late autumn of 1940, the Brest Office resumed its former activities. By this time, the effects of the initial shock, which had so shaken the French, had faded. The demobilized French soldiers had returned to their homes, and the most energetic and enterprising among them began to make their way to the Free France forces under de Gaulle. A large number of them attempted to reach England from the small harbours of Brittany in fishing boats, and many of them felt that they were bound to return not empty-handed, with whatever information they could gather about the German occupation forces, their disposition and armament. In turn, de Gaulle's intelligence also sought to penetrate France through these French ports. Control of the innumerable little hamlets scattered along the deserted and rocky shores of Brittany therefore became a problem of paramount importance. A dense network of coast and port guards and patrols had to be organized, and this was supplemented by the formation of the enlarged Coastal Border Surveillance Force, a kind of militarized customs office with its headquarters in Paris, staffed only by reserve officers of the old and new Wehrmacht and manned exclusively by ex-soldiers. This organization cooperated with the Abwehr in the most loyal manner. At the turn of 1940-1941, these new measures brought the first results, when a group was captured trying to reach England with very detailed reports on German occupation forces and fortifications on the Channel coast. Shortly afterwards, a trawler near Brest, carrying 2 British agents with a radio transmitter, fell into German hands. They were picked up at sea at one of the rendezvous points where Breton fishermen met up with comrades who had managed to escape to England and pass on reports and agents. Trawls engaged in sardine and tuna fishing had a range of 100 nautical miles and could remain at sea for days. The simplest solution, of course, would have been to prohibit all fishing or to confine it to the line of sight near the coast. But such drastic action might have resulted in the loss of valuable food. The German officers stationed in occupied France were agreed that Gaullist intelligence was conducted in a dignified and gentlemanly manner. But everything changed when militant communism appeared on the scene. The idea of using the French communists' favoritism to Moscow as a means of undermining the resistance of the French army and for sabotaging military supplies had been suggested to Abwehr headquarters by one officer of the Special Forces Training and Exercise Battalion No. 800 and prototype of the Brandenburg Regiment. A long time ago. It met with hesitation and reticence, however. Canaris himself was opposed to the idea, for he was too ardently anti-communist to like it. Nevertheless, the idea was too good to be rejected from the doorstep. During the winter months of 1939-40, which the troops on the Western Front spent in inactivity, the Information Department of the Foreign Office produced a series of leaflets and pamphlets designed to undermine the morale of the French army, based mainly on 2 slogans, "Dying for Danzig" and "English fighting for the last French." These slogans were loudly trumpeted over loudspeakers from the banks of the Rhine and the Western Wall, and hundreds of thousands of pamphlets with the same text were distributed, some by aeroplanes and some addressed through the post to individuals throughout France. The leaflet "Dying for Dancing" was especially plentifully scattered, to ensure that they were not conspicuous, but remained indistinguishable from normal mail. These leaflets were enclosed in envelopes of every conceivable size and colour, and addresses were applied by hundreds of different hands. The task of promoting this huge mass of paper to a given country was entrusted to the Abwehr and other government departments. Some letters were sent in Switzerland and in the then still neutral Belgium, but most of them, already with French stamps, were smuggled by the Belgian Abwehr organization into France, and they're mailed as usual. The Abwehr was already using its links with members and functionaries of the Belgian Communist Party to distribute defeatist and anti-British leaflets in France, and at the same time communist agents were receiving instructions and technical instructions for acts of sabotage in the French war industry. The idea of the common struggle of Germany and the Soviet Union against the capitalist and imperialist Western powers, and Thoris's defection on 6 October 1939 were successfully exploited. However, the most stunning propaganda effect was created by Molotov's declaration on 31 October 1939, in which he stated, "It is criminal to take any part in this war, which is a war for the destruction of National Socialism disguised as a struggle on behalf of democracy." This declaration was immediately distributed in leaflet form from aeroplanes over all of France. To Canaris, as has already been said, the whole idea of cooperation with the Soviets was repugnant, and indeed he tolerated it with the greatest reluctance. And, as many other officers of the old imperial era rejected it in their hearts and supported it only with the utmost hesitation and restraint, liaison with the communists was maintained chiefly by 2 subordinate officials in military intelligence, and for the most part on their personal initiative and responsibility. However, during the French campaign in May 1940, interrogations of prisoners and other sources confirmed that these subversive pamphlets had in fact found their way to the troops. Many of the prisoners still kept the leaflets and produced them in support of their demands for preferential treatment. On the basis of this evidence, a special headquarters was formed with the task of maintaining contact with the French communists, but with a new set of slogans. These were now directed against de Gaulle, who was portrayed as a mercenary tool of Western imperialism, and against the reactionary British ally who had so shamefully abandoned the French in their distress. With the help of the communists, contact was established through Marseilles with the Arab nationalist movement Destour, a political party in Tunisia, founded in 1920 and aimed at liberating Tunisia from French colonial rule. Note, with the task of inciting anti-British sentiment in the French North African colonial army. The latter, however, proved insensitive to subversive influences, for it was completely unfazed by the catastrophe in metropolitan France, and only in the navy, with its traditionally anti-British sympathies, was any success achieved. On the other hand, in occupied France, the communists were working with great zeal to disseminate subversive pamphlets launched by the German Secret Service. In many cases, it is true, completely unaware of the source from which these leaflets were appearing. Even the French press took them seriously. In July 1940, the communist newspaper Humanite wrote, "General de Gaulle and other puppets of British financial circles would very much like to see France fighting for the city, but for these gentlemen the French answer is Mot de Cambon, being probably a typo, meaning Mot de Cambron, literally the word of Cambron, the famous reply of Pierre Cambron, who commanded Napoleon's old guard at Waterloo. Shit. The guard dies but does not surrender. Voici noch not." In March 1941, another newspaper, In Avant, wrote, "The Gaullists, as representatives of the city bankers, have wedded themselves to British imperialism." And on 20 June 1941, 48 hours before Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union, Humanite declared, "De Gaulle and Catroux are encouraging the murder of the French for the benefit of the British." 2 days later, the activities of Special Staff H suddenly ceased. With the attack on Russia on 22 June 1941, the French communists were given a new order by the Kremlin, and they obeyed it with the same unquestioning obedience as before. From then on, the German army of occupation found itself face to face with a close and united front. The alliance of Gaullists and communists shaped the French resistance movement, and it was an alliance destined to retain its significance long after the official cessation of hostilities. On the German side, the fight against the activities of hostile intelligence agencies was at first in the hands of the Wehrmacht, but the longer the war lasted, the more the fight against the resistance movement heated up, and with it, to some extent, the fight against enemy intelligence services was handed over to Himmler's SD. The SD had its own statutes and its own peculiar methods, and unfortunately the Supreme Staff, on Hitler's orders, became increasingly ruthless in its repressive measures, especially in its stance on the shooting of hostages. The Abwehr was of the opinion that the shooting of hostages was not only contrary to international laws, but, by failing to achieve its purpose at all and causing terror in the hearts of the people, produced quite the opposite effect. While the struggle against the Gaullists was fought on both sides in a dignified and honourable manner, the introduction of communist terrorists gave it a completely different character on the French side. The lively and active forces of communism soon drove the moderate Gaullists from the leadership, and attacks on members of the German armed forces, depots and other military installations began with increasing frequency. The years 1942–1943 were notable for the great expansion of hostile espionage and subversion. Radio operators and saboteurs were transferred into the country by the most conceivable means, and by the end of 1943, a systematic infiltration of resistance group organizers had begun, which went hand in hand with commando raids on coastal and other isolated targets. At the turn of 1941–1942, one of the largest enemy spy organizations, known to the Abwehr as Organisation Intralite Union Organization, was uncovered and several hundred men were arrested. This organization consisted of a widespread spy network under the leadership of a former officer of the Polish General Staff and a leading staff drawn from the small nations of the Allies. It did splendid work and was more effective than the British or Gaullist intelligence services. After this blow, the activities of the agents in occupied France quieted down a little for a time, but during 1942 they intensified with renewed vigour. As before, the use of single-masted fishing boats and small British naval vessels as a means of entry and exit was favoured. The long coastline, and especially the coast of Brittany, rugged and mottled with myriads of small bays and inlets, precluded any possibility of effective control. Another popular route was through Spain and the Pyrenees, and here, too, it was very difficult to organize effective security. The biggest hole in the German security network, however, was the line of demarcation between occupied and unoccupied France, and the Russian campaign had so reduced the strength of the occupying forces that just at this point effective control was virtually non-existent. The ease with which reports could be sent across the demarcation line and the comparative impunity of enemy agents in the use of radio transmitters in the unoccupied zone gave the enemy a great additional advantage. Finally, there was still a route by air. Reports began to come in with increasing frequency of unidentified aeroplanes flying into the airspace of unoccupied territory, circling over areas totally devoid of military interest, flying obviously not reconnaissance flights and certainly not dropping bombs. What they were dropping were agents and containers of propaganda material, weapons, ammunition, explosives and instructions for their use, and more radios. German counterintelligence had made very notable advances against the enemy, but, of course, the greater the success, the more circumspect our opponents became, whereas in the first half of 1942, the information gatherer and the radio operator were, in general, one and the same person with perhaps one or two collaborators. It soon became common for one chief to direct a whole group of agents who were more often than not complete strangers to each other. It was therefore not enough to eliminate a detected enemy radio transmitter if the operator's further communications remained unknown. To assist the counterintelligence, Wehrmacht and military police radio communication companies equipped with direction finding equipment capable of establishing the approximate location of an enemy transmitter. In addition to the fixed direction finding stations, there were also mobile units disguised as ordinary civilian cars with civilian license plates and manned by men in civilian clothes who drove around the countryside. There was also a Nahfeld apparatus that would go into action when one of the fixed or mobile stations confirmed the presence of an enemy transmitter. This precise equipment was particularly useful in densely populated areas when a transmitter was in a particular neighborhood of a city and its exact location had to be established. Even in these cases, intervention was extremely difficult and required intensive surveillance of each individual house, and, in the case of multi-story buildings, each floor. The technical determination of the transmitter's location was by no means the last step. The work of the Abwehr, that is, the penetration of the enemy's network, had to be continued with even greater vigor. The arrest of an enemy radio operator was only half the battle. In 1942, for the first time in France, the Germans succeeded in overpowering an enemy radio operator Ate, that is, in forcing him to continue to work with his radio and with his cipher, sending to his headquarters reports prepared for him by his new masters. In this case, the opponent was the British intelligence service, with whom it was both a worthwhile endeavour and a pleasure to cross swords. Maintaining this kind of correspondence over the radio is not at all easy. The operator must not be overly bombarded with misinformation, and he must send messages in which truth and fiction are carefully mixed and balanced. To continue to successfully mislead the enemy in this way requires a strict centralization of control. For, obviously, if there are 7 nannies, the game will become impossible to play, and a judicious mixture of truth and fiction will be hopelessly corrupted. Such a task was therefore entrusted to Abwehr Group IID itself. Only in exceptional cases was some decentralization allowed, but always Berlin had to be consulted, especially in answering any specific questions posed by the enemy. These reciprocal exchanges with the British intelligence service lasted for varying periods of time, and some were maintained for quite a long time. It was not always necessary to reverse a radio operator. Sometimes the Germans were lucky enough to get hold of a radio operator with his radio, call signs and ciphers before he started work, and contact could then be established and maintained using the enemy operator. For example, for many months, the British intelligence service was deluded into believing that there was a resistance group committing all sorts of acts of sabotage, like destruction, train wrecks, attacks on Wehrmacht personnel. It's by using attacks that actually took place, together with attacks that were prevented, and by slipping false reports into the French press, it was possible to outwit any check that might put an end to this game. This resistance phantom group enjoyed such a reliable reputation in Britain that all arms, explosives and other things requested by radio for it, were urgently dropped by British aircraft to the agreed places, and the Abwehr headquarters gradually accumulated a whole armoury of arms, ammunition and explosives of all kinds. The Germans were particularly pleased to receive plastic explosives, a doughy substance which could be stuck to an object to be destroyed, and there were a whole bunch of seemingly innocuous items like jam and food jars, bottles of motor oil, especially the familiar shell bottles. And in addition to the usual revolvers, it was a pleasure to receive stem-light machine guns. The British supplier to the royal court did not confine itself to sending only arms and military supplies. Food and luxuries rained down, and the Abwehr soon built up a good stock of such rarities as cigarettes and real coffee. Organising the dropping of these parcels was always a nervous business. The site had to be carefully chosen, the right light signals had to be set up, a reception team had to be prepared to receive the containers, and any agent who might be dropped with them. The difficulty of the task was multiplied by the fact that the reception had to be carried out in civilian clothes and without the knowledge of German troops who might be stationed nearby, because they were not trained for this kind of work, and their intervention would probably lead to disaster and break the precious chain of radio communication. Besides, any dropped agents would have to believe, at least at first, that they had actually met a genuine reception team from the resistance movement. For a time, Abwehr headquarters had no less than 5 separate lines of communication with British intelligence. In all, between April 1942 and March 1943, it managed to disarm over 80 enemy radio transmitters and capture most of the radio operators and equipment. In some cases, especially when the opponents took the precaution of having several radio transmitters in several houses for the use of a single radio operator, only the operator could be caught, or only one transmitter could be found. But once it became apparent that such precautions were being taken, techniques were used which devalued such precautions. In March 1943, there were only 6 active enemy radio transmitters in the originally occupied zone, and in the newly occupied zone there were already about 20, and here the Abwehr proved worth something. These radio communications with the enemy also put the Abwehr on the trail of a part of the Soviet spy organization known as the Red Chapel, which was working in France and of which I shall have more to say in the chapter on Soviet Russia. At its head was an Air Force Reserve Lieutenant Schulz-Boysen, working in the Air Ministry, who also managed to arrange for some of his agents in the Abwehr itself. After repeated failures in parachuting Abwehr I agents and attributing them to errors in technical training, the Air Ministry was asked to send an officer experienced in parachuting to take charge of the preparation and execution of future operations. Schulz-Boysen succeeded in getting a certain Lieutenant Golnow, who was a member of his organization and who was able to keep him informed of all the Abwehr's plans. Later, however, an investigation by the Gestapo could find no indication that he had taken advantage of his opportunities. The Gestapo's attempt to capitalize on Golnow's presence in the Abwehr IE department was not successful, and the whole affair was confined to those members of the organization who had managed to get a job in the Air Ministry. One part of this organization worked in France under the direction of a Soviet intelligence officer. He succeeded in winning the favor of various female staff members who worked in the offices of the Commander-in-Chief of the troops in occupied France, the secretary to the chief of one of the branches of the military administration, who worked in the auxiliary section of the Commander-in-Chief's office in the Chamber of Deputies, was of invaluable assistance to him. It was she who introduced him to other subordinates in the Commander-in-Chief's office and to several officers, all on a purely social basis. She not only delivered secret materials to this Russian, but even provided him with the seal of the Chancellery. The other workers and officers involved in the affair were guilty only of carelessly mentioning, in ordinary small talk, matters that had to be kept secret. The Russian and his chief accomplice were arrested before any serious damage was done. It then transpired that the woman had been hired without going through the usual security checks, and that she was the wife of a German living in Paris and had worked for many years before as a variety artist in Soviet Russia. Incidentally, attempts have been made to glorify the Red Chapel and to give it the character of some underground resistance movement. It is very likely that there were absolutely sincere people in the ranks of the organization who honestly believed that they were supporting a purely internal organization hostile to the Nazi regime. However, nothing can change the fact that the Red Chapel was purely a Soviet spy organization that committed an act of treachery on a huge scale. Raids by British commandos on the French coast from 1942 onwards added new challenges to the Abwehr. The first more or less enemy sortie was a raid on a German detection and gunnery base, an installation that roughly corresponded to a British radar station. The chosen site was on the coast near Etretat between Fécamp and Le Havre, and it was garrisoned by a few RAF personnel. Under cover of darkness, a British sabotage team managed to land undetected and overpower the weak garrison, capturing one prisoner, before nearby troops managed to intervene and drive the raiders back to their landing boats. The British had plenty of time to disassemble and take with them the most important units of Freya and Wurzburg equipment they were so eager to obtain. As a result of the first Commando raid, the Abwehr Air Headquarters was ordered to prepare and send to the Supreme Headquarters a detailed report, not only covering these events, but also containing observations on the security measures in force, the facts of any violation of international laws by the enemy, and suggestions for improving defense measures. For its part, the Abwehr was fully aware of the potential danger that these raids by British commandos could pose. But despite the increased coastal control, the raids became more frequent and extensive. On the island of Sark in the Channel, a shore patrol of about 10 men was captured and taken prisoner. One managed to escape and reported that, contrary to international law, the prisoners were handcuffed while being transferred to a landing craft. The High Command immediately ordered that henceforth all British prisoners should be handcuffed, and from this incident followed a rather long period of mutual reprisals on both sides. Much larger in scale was the raid on Saint-Nazaire. The enemy succeeded in ramming the gates of the shipping lock into the harbour with his destroyer, which was used almost as a brander. A most unpleasant success from the German point of view, because this lock was used as a dry dock. The attack itself was repulsed with heavy losses, and from the destroyer, which had not yet sunk, copies of the complete orders for the whole expedition were salvaged, and it was also possible to disarm a powerful explosive charge, which would otherwise have caused considerable damage. Reconnaissance by force on a large scale was carried out against Dieppe, and this, thanks to the resistance offered by the German garrison, was repulsed with heavy losses in men and equipment to the enemy. A certain officer of the old Western Campaign Marines discovered a complete order of battle on one of the landing craft, and the interrogation of the prisoners yielded extremely interesting information. From the nature of the operation and the method by which it was carried out, it became evident that the purpose of the raid was not merely to damage and tie up the troops, but also to gather data for the preparation of an invasion and the opening of a second front in Europe. Always in favour of any attempted invasion was the fact that the Western occupied territories were exceptionally weak in troop numbers, and therefore it was easy to understand the anxiety of the headquarters responsible for defence. In order to obtain a clear picture of the enemy's intentions, the Abwehr set about carefully evaluating all information from agents and other sources relating to enemy intelligence targets. Large-scale maps were drawn of all these intelligence targets, whether geographical locations or troop dispositions, with dates, and an attempt was made to draw conclusions as to possible enemy invasion intentions. By early 1943, a clear system of points of greatest interest to enemy intelligence began to emerge. It was centred in the vicinity of the Pass de Calais, the Seine estuary, and the sector west of Bordeaux. Secondary targets could be the French south coast between Ceuta and Marseilles and the west coast of Brittany. It seemed a mystery to the Germans why these commando raids were conducted in a distinctly gangster fashion, with participants painting their hands and faces black and wearing special camouflage clothing. A later raid on Port-en-Bessin in the Seine estuary was carried out with little success, and another against Caskets, in which one sergeant and 2 soldiers were captured. An attack carried out in December 1942 against German blockade breakers in the Gironde estuary, on the other hand, was the most successful, although in the opinion of the Abwehr it could have been prevented. A few days earlier it happened that 2 British soldiers of the Royal Marines, as usual with their hands and faces painted black, had been captured at Pointe de Grave at the tip of the Gironde estuary. They wore uniforms well suited to this type of enterprise, with patches indicating rank, and when questioned they gave their rank and unit number. Unfortunately, the interrogation was not conducted by Abwehr officers, or any officers in any way suitable for interrogating prisoners, and no positive results were obtained. Moreover, no further interrogation by Abwehr officers took place, because the prisoners were immediately shot in accordance with Hitler's order on saboteurs. A few days after the capture of these soldiers, a group of ships breaking through the blockade on the Europe-Japan route was sunk by plastic bombs while they were anchored in Bordeaux harbour. A British submarine in the Gironde estuary launched 6 collapsible boats, each manned by 2 officers or sergeants of the Royal Marines, which then travelled up the Gironde all the way to Bordeaux. One boat sank soon after launching, and its passengers swam to shore. These were the 2 prisoners discussed above. The others travelled the long estuary of the Gironde as far as Bordeaux, hiding during the day in the coastal reeds, and thus reached their destination and successfully attacked their objects. A few were taken prisoners, a few were killed, and the rest reached the Spanish frontier safely. Maps and instructions for escape through Spain were found on the captives. This enterprise was splendidly planned. It was executed with extreme boldness and achieved considerable success. It led, as may be imagined, to the introduction of measures crucial to the work of the Abwehr in France, which were designed to draw a line of demarcation between the work of the Wehrmacht and that of Himmler's organization. As its sphere of control steadily increased, Himmler insisted on the dissolution of the secret field police in France and the transfer of its functions and powers to the security police and the security service. In the summer of 1942, an order to this effect came from the Führer, and at the same time all executive power in occupied France was taken away from the military commander and transferred to the newly created department of the commander of the security police and security services in France. Thus, these latter 2 organizations satisfied their long-held ambitions and took over counterintelligence at last. The task of the Abwehr thus became considerably more difficult, for not only could it no longer give orders to the secret field police, but it was now itself forced to turn to the secret police and the security services for help, and the harsh repressive measures introduced by the latter simply led to the steady growth of the resistance movement. The occupation of an initially unoccupied area of France, following the Anglo-American landings in North Africa at the end of 1942, gave a new impetus to the resistance movement. The German troops available for this occupation were numerically too weak to ensure the maintenance of law and order in the country, and the deserted areas of the Massif Central, the Cevennes and the Alps regions very quickly became a refuge for resistance fighters. The Abwehr's activities in France, however, were not limited to dealing with hostile intelligence services and fighting those who assisted the resistance movement from the outside. As time went on, there were fewer and fewer opportunities for intelligence work in other parts of the world, and so the Abwehr was forced to establish contacts with the outside world via the French Atlantic coast. For this purpose, men with experience of long-distance sailing were required. Among them, Captain Nissen stood out. He gave the following account of the 3 expeditions he conducted. At the beginning of June 1940, I was called up as a sapper, having previously served in the Special Forces Training Regiment 800, Brandenburg. Without any prior training, I, still a civilian, was ordered to go through Holland and Belgium to France, and there to find a ship suitable for transporting agents across the Channel to England or Ireland. Following the rapidly advancing German armies, I reached the Atlantic coast of France, and in the small fishing port of Camaret-sur-Mer, in the Bay of Brest, found a small 30-foot yacht, built and equipped as a fishing boat. She belonged to a French colonel, military attaché at the French mission at Bern, whose wife had fled Paris and was living at this time on this yacht. I informed the lady that I regretted to ask her to seek other accommodation on shore, as I considered her yacht suitable for my purposes. When I reported my discovery to the Abwehr, I was ordered to prepare the vessel for use on a certain day, and to land discreetly 3 agents at any place in southern Ireland which I thought convenient for the purpose. Presumably to save the vessel from confiscation by the German troops, the propeller had been removed, and as I was unable to find a substitute for it in so short a time, I had to solve my task by sailing alone. As to the crew, the neighbouring base at Brest sent me a drunken Breton fisherman of about 60 years of age, who had been found for us by a French agent. My 3 passengers were 2 young Germans, born in South Africa, and an Indian living in Hamburg, where he was employed as a ship's supply agent. My duties were confined to acting as captain, and I had no idea of their mission. I first set a course strictly west, into the North Atlantic, then turned slightly north and then east, heading for the south coast of Ireland. After 3 days of sailing, I disembarked my passengers in a small dinghy under cover of darkness in Baltimore Bay, near Fastnet Rock on the southwestern tip of Ireland. I had intended during the night to get away from the Irish coast, but the wind, which had hitherto been strong, suddenly died down completely, and I drifted helplessly along the shore until morning. The yacht was disguised as a French fishing vessel, and I hoisted the French flag, probably owing to which 2 British warships passed me without remark. 7 days later, I arrived safe and sound at Brest. The successful completion of my voyage on a solo voyage owed much to the fact that my old Breton fisherman turned out to be one of the best sailors I have ever sailed with. In October 1940, I was ordered by Abwehr to secretly land 2 agents in Sligo Bay in the northwest of Ireland. In this operation, I commanded one of the famous French tuna trawlers, the Annie Bras-Bihen of Douarnenez. I had the ship well camouflaged and prepared to put to sea, and on the day appointed for sailing, I sent a crew of 4 Frenchmen with a Danish engineer. Unhappily, these 4 Frenchmen proved quite useless as seamen, while the Dane became so seasick in the storm we got into on the traverse of Limerick and 150 nautical miles west of Ireland, that he was quite incapable of servicing the engines and allowed the compressed air from our last cylinder, which we used to start the diesel engine, to leak. The storm raged for 5 days, and with the greatest difficulty and a minimum of sails, I kept our vessel afloat. Without engines, I was forced to abandon the continuation of the journey, and with my helpless crew sailed back to the port of departure. The foreign crew given me proved utterly useless, but the 2 German soldiers, however inexperienced, were of great assistance to me and proved themselves first-rate fellows in every respect. When I reported to the Abwehr section of the High Command, I was told that because of the tighter blockade, the task of sending agents abroad on neutral ships had become extremely difficult, if not impossible. Asked whether I saw any possibility of overcoming this problem, I replied that it was sometimes quite possible to land agents even on the smallest vessels, provided they were conscientiously equipped in a seaworthy manner and properly equipped and manned, provided I was allowed to choose the ship and select the crew myself. I was prepared, I said, to undertake such an operation. I was then instructed to find a suitable ship, equip it and assemble a crew for a voyage to a certain port south of Buenos Aires in Argentina. In Pamplona harbour I found an ocean-going yacht, built in England, which I had known before the war and which our local maritime authorities had requisitioned for me from its French owner. In 4 months I managed to prepare the vessel for a 5-month voyage, without a port call, and to recruit volunteers consisting of German long-distance sailors and yachtsmen, all of whom had the necessary professional qualifications and experience and promised to become a loyal and reliable ship's crew. This last condition, in my opinion, was the most important condition for the successful fulfillment of the operation. Indeed, the crew turned out to be so excellent that any one of its members could operate the ship at least as well as I could. During the preparatory period, I was informed by the High Command of the exact details of the plan. First of all, we were not going to Argentina, but we were taking aboard a boa was a Dutch settler in South Africa named Bobby Leibrandt and a radio operator to South Africa. Leibrandt wanted to be landed on a deserted shore as close to Cape Town as possible. After studying the desired stretch of coastline, I decided to land him near Green River, about 150 miles north of Cape Town, where 2 rock formations known as the Twin protect the beach from the giant waves that characterize the entire African coastline. On 1 April 1941, I reported the ship ready to sail. The day before departure, Bobby Leibrandt arrived accompanied by a radio operator with a very impressive amount of equipment, which consisted of sabotage materials and 2 radios. The paperwork listed the yacht as an auxiliary warship of the German Navy under my command as a fleet lieutenant. The crew, including Leibrandt and the radio operator, were also presented as German naval petty officers and supplied with the necessary account books. On the 2nd of April, the yacht was towed from Pamplona to Brest Bay by 2 patrol ships of the German Navy, and on the 3rd of April we put to sea from Commando. From the start we were harassed by very bad weather, and Leibrandt was seasick for several days in succession. We deliberately sailed far west into the North Atlantic before turning south to avoid encounters with British reconnaissance aircraft for as long as possible, and to keep away from the routes of British convoys travelling from Africa to Europe. It was agreed that in case of danger at sea, we would say it was an American yacht. After about 10 days, Leibrandt recovered from seasickness, and the captain ordered him to prepare all the subversive material to throw overboard in case we were stopped by any enemy ship. He refused to obey this order on the ground that, as a drill, he was not under the jurisdiction of the German captain. He also refused to allow a radio operator to accompany him ashore, because, as he stated, this man did not speak English and would therefore only become a source of danger to Leibrandt in South Africa. Beyond the Azores, an aeroplane suddenly appeared out of the clouds and hovered over the yacht. It was a British aeroplane, and it made circles over us suspiciously, but when we gave it a friendly wave it flew away. After this disturbance, however, we began to keep a closer watch, by which we were able by timely and elusive manoeuvre to keep out of the paths of any enemy aircraft which suddenly appeared on the horizon. Now the weather had improved, and we had advanced far ahead. On 4 May 1941, we crossed the equator. On 8 May it was discovered that the main water tank was leaking. We managed to get it hastily repaired, but because of this I began to doubt whether we could continue sailing. On 14 May, at a distance of about 25 nautical miles, we passed the island of Trinidad near the coast of Brazil. On the 28th of May we reached latitude 29°22, the southernmost point of the voyage. The weather steadily deteriorated, but the wind from the west still prevailed, and this helped us in our progress towards the African coast. On the 31st of May we were struck by a very violent hurricane from the southeast, which lasted 2 days and a half, during which the ship was saved from serious danger only by the skill of her crew. On the 3rd of June we passed at a distance of about 5 miles a steamer going in the opposite direction, which however did not notice us. On the 7th of June we were caught in another severe gale, and were compelled to lie adrift for several days. When the wind died down, we set a course for the African coast. The cloudy sky and continuous thick fog excluded any possibility of any accurate astronomical observations, and we continued to sail in the approximate direction to the coast. The next day bad weather again prevented me from establishing our position, but I continued on the same course during the night of 8-9 June. There was a dense fog, and all preparations were made for Leibrandt's landing on shore. His luggage was stowed in an inflatable boat and securely fastened, and we intended to land him at the first opportunity during the night. Several echo sounder measurements showed that we were close to shore, but we couldn't tell if we were making the right approach. There was tension on board. The wind had died down noticeably. Long before the shore was visible, our sense of smell told us that we were close to shore. And then we sailed with the engine towards the shore, which was visible before us in the bright moonlight. In terrible haste measurements were made, and to our delight we found that we had arrived exactly at our destination, the Gemini, a marvellous achievement in navigation on the part of Paul Team, who, alas, was later killed. Leibrand was desperately rowing his oars towards the shore. The yacht immediately lay on the other tack, and in a few minutes disappeared again into the thick fog which had been such a boon to our operation. Our mission was accomplished, and we hoped that we could bring the ship and crew home safe and sound. The whole voyage lasted 67 days, during which a distance of 8,111 nautical miles was covered. On the 12th of June we passed a steamer which was rapidly approaching us, taking a counter-course. But fortunately this ship proved to be Portuguese the very next day, however. And of course it was Friday the 13th. We noticed another steamer coming towards us so fast that we had no time to dodge it. The ship was coming straight at us, and turned out to be a British auxiliary cruiser. He ordered us by signals to stop and gave us the name and nationality. This was the most critical moment of the whole voyage, and we were overjoyed to have safely put our passenger ashore with his suspicious luggage. Although we were on board as military seamen, for the sake of disguise we were dressed in old rat-catcher rags, and there was no sign of discipline on board. We calmly continued to sail our course, paying no attention to the signals, all too well understood that this ship was giving us. But our hearts clearly went to our heels at the unpleasant thought that we were likely to spend the rest of the war as prisoners of war. The enemy ship came within hearing distance, and we could make out the uniformed officers and crew ready to launch the lifeboat. I took a deep sip from my brandy flask and ordered the American pennant to be hoisted. "What kind of ship is that?" came a shout over the water. "White Star," I replied in my typical Yankee accent. "Where are you going?" "To the land of our Lord." "Are you all right?" "Yes, thank you. I'm fine." This seemed to convince the captain of the auxiliary cruiser that we were indeed an American yacht, and as we slowly returned to our original course, his crew bid us a friendly farewell by shouting "Hip Hip Hooray" to Roosevelt. To this we gave a patriotic response, and all turned out well. At that time there was great danger that the Americans might at any moment occupy the Azores, so we decided not to return to France, but to head for the Spanish port of Villa Cisneros in the Rio de Rio of Spanish Morocco. On 22 June we reached our destination and the journey was over. In exactly Po days we had sailed a distance of 14,128 nautical miles. Our ship had a displacement of 34 tonnes and was rigged like a cutter, a single-masted sailing ship with oblique, usually gaff-rigged sails. Footnote. With a sail of 60 feet and a total surface area of 430 square feet, Lebrant became a source of great trouble for the South African authorities for several months. Together with his political associates, he organised a series of sabotage, bombings, and very intense underground anti-British propaganda. But in the end, he failed. He was captured, but he managed to save his life. Based in France, the Abwehr was engaged in many projects. In accordance with Admiral Canaris's policy of decentralization, the plans for these projects were drawn up and executed on the spot by people who had a convenient base for them. An example of the results this could lead to, although geographically not as impressive as the drill landing at Gemini, relates to the failed vegetable oil project. This was a plan to make up for European fat shortages by utilizing vegetable oil and other fats from French West Africa, partly because of the impossibility of transporting them and partly as a result of their continuous accumulation. Huge warehouses were built, and the potential supply of oilseed crops of all varieties in these territories was so large that if only it could be secured, there would be more than enough to meet the needs of the whole of Europe. Owing to British naval operations, however, it was impossible at this time to import them in sufficient quantities even for the needs of North Africa and unoccupied France. Something else had therefore to be found to secure these valuable supplies for Europe. To this end, and in cooperation with the Vichy government, it was proposed to collect and ship as many ordinary small grinders and choppers as could be found throughout France and Germany. With these, oil crops could be squeezed, albeit primitively, and a pipeline built to pump the resulting oil to some North African port. This method was expected to produce about 200,000 tons of oil annually. Of course, the decisive condition was the support of the Vichy government and the German authorities, because only through the cooperation of these two parties could the plan be realized. As usual, the preliminary preparations were accompanied by many postponements. At last, however, agreement was reached in principle, and an expedition was sent out to survey the route that the projected pipeline would take from the bend in the Niger River to the North African coast. The expedition was organized in 3 columns. It was joined by knowledgeable officers of the French colonial service, well acquainted with the terrain to be crossed, and was equipped with special vehicles for traveling through the desert. The Abwehr managed to embed several agents in the expedition with the task of reporting by radio everything they saw of military interest, and especially the left column, which was traveling eastwards from the bend in the Niger in the general direction of the Tibesti Massif. The expedition left Marseilles at the end of October 1942. But because of delays caused by bureaucracy, both French and German, it was still in the city of Algiers when Anglo-American troops landed on 8 November, and it came to a premature end. Spain presented problems of an entirely different order, for she was both neutral and friendly to Germany. Here, too, the tact and personality of Admiral Canaris were of great importance and of great value to the Abwehr. Perhaps nowhere, except in Spain, did the high qualities of Canaris render the greatest direct service to German interests. Canaris's attachment to Spain and the Spanish was deep and sincere. It was there that he had sought refuge in World War I, and Franco's struggle against communism coincided with his own implacable anti-Bolshevik views. It may be doubted whether German aid to Franco during the Civil War was solely the result of Canaris's persistence, as has often been stated in the press in recent years. But he surely supported German intervention wholeheartedly and from the most sincere motives. With the Condor Legion flew to Spain a powerful group of specialists of the Abwehr, which later, when the Civil War ended, turned into a military organization and which, during the Second World War, was of great importance. The high reputation that Canaris enjoyed in Spain and the ties of friendship that bound him to Franco and many of his generals of the Civil War days, such as Jordana, who later became foreign minister, and Vigan, chief of the general staff, were very important to the intelligence service. From Spain, intelligence was organized in Britain and France, and branches of the military organization were established at San Sebastian, Barcelona, Algeciras, and Tetuan in Spanish Morocco. The branch at Algeciras, which kept a continuous watch on shipping through the Strait of Gibraltar, was also of immense value to the German Navy. The fact that every day many hundreds of Spanish labourers crossed back and forth between La Linea and Gibraltar greatly facilitated the observation of the harbour and the reconnaissance of the fortress itself. Photographs of the cliff were taken periodically, with telescopic cameras, from a villa on the shore of Algeciras Bay. When enlarged into a single composite image, the pictures gave a clear view of every machine gun and anti-aircraft battery. Similarly, shipping was monitored at both day and night with special night lenses, and in coordination with the Abwehr's Estrecho office on the African coast, information about departing Allied and convoy ships and their course was immediately reported to naval headquarters in Berlin. The British, of course, were well aware that the Abwehr was watching them, and often tried to mislead us by sending ships into the Atlantic, and then turning them round and guiding them through the strait under cover of darkness and vice versa. From the Abwehr office in Tetuan, Arab demonstrations were organized, supported by auxiliary bases in the Blue Sultan of Ifni Rio de Oro. Among the labourers who crossed the Gibraltar border back and forth daily, several saboteurs managed to slip in, who carried out acts of minor sabotage and are said to have blown up some temporary ammunition depots. There were also sabotage attacks on Allied ships in southern Spanish ports, using explosives hidden in crates of oranges and other cargoes that were loaded on board. While planning Operation Felix, the attack on Gibraltar, Canaris began discussions with his personal friend, High Commissioner Begbere, who was characterized by strong pro-Allied sympathies, regarding the possibility of including some camouflaged units of the Brandenburg Regiment in the Spanish Foreign Legion. However, Begbeder took the matter very evasively and slowly, and moreover without any enthusiasm, he was about to leave for America. Canaris took a keen interest in these Spanish units, which under the name of the Blue Division fought on the Eastern Front, and did everything he could to ensure that in a friendly manner all difficulties, inevitably arising between Spanish and German troops, were removed. When Franco gave up his status as a non-military state, moving to complete neutrality in 1944, the change naturally had a strong restrictive effect on the activities of the Abwehr services in Spain. Just as Canaris was going to Spain to see what he could do to salvage the situation, news came to him from Madrid that he was no longer allowed to cross the Spanish border. He then invited Martinez Campos, chief of Spanish intelligence, to meet him at Biarritz, but this offer was declined. And, although the military organization in Spain continued to function until the surrender, real cooperation between the German and Spanish intelligence services was coming to an end. But the great days of the Abwehr were also by then coming to an end.